The waitering service. Oh, bugger.
So what we've got left is water efficiency update.
Yeah.
And then the two presentations, 15, 16.
Yeah.
Oh, and one items. Yeah. Yep. 14. Sorry. Yeah.
Oh, Charlie, that's very healthy.
Full of flip.
You're good at picking up the scraps, aren't you?
Oh, kia ora everyone, welcome back. We're going to resume with the water efficiency update. Ian.
Thank you, Chair. Look, I'm very, very briefly going to introduce you to the team. Monique Benson, you may not have met, who's our water advisor. Brendan, you have met before. I'm not sure whether Brendan's been in front of you in his current role as Catchment Policy Implementation Advisor, Manager, sorry. This is an area of our work that you don't really hear and see a lot about. Quite relevant and pertinent now in the conditions we've got. So we thought great opportunity to bring to you a bit of a summary and a view of the work we've got on in this space. So I'll hand over to the team.
Thank you. So we'll take the paper as read, but Monique's just going to run through a brief presentation, picking out some of the key points of the paper, just going through a bit of context, history of the work that's been done, current and future direction, and links with the water security program.
Hi, so as Brendan mentioned, my name's Monique Benson. I've been a water management advisor at the Regional Council here since 2009, working on a range of projects. So, as we've got a range of understanding of irrigation, I've just got some fundamentals here to run through. Hawke's Bay currently has recent estimations of irrigation area in Hawke's Bay are over 28,800 hectares. We have done a number of studies in the region, which I'll talk about later, and it's highlighted that we do have a range of irrigation system performance in the region, and we also have a variable knowledge from our irrigators, ranging from very little to very detailed knowledge of the irrigation. We have a wide range of land use types, as you will well know, which are largely categorised by pasture, cropping, orcharding and viticulture, which then means that we actually have a range of irrigation system types. So just so that we all have an understanding, can you see that? Yep. So this here is a gun. You will have seen those in the fields with the big reel at the end, also known as a travelling irrigator. Pivots, everyone has seen those, so well familiar with those, but we often refer to drip micro irrigation, which is not one type of system. This is your drip system here, and often usually used in viticulture and sometimes in orcharding. And then the micro system are these little sprinklers, and there's a range of different types that you can get. So why do we need to work on efficiency? Irrigation system performance and management can affect water consumption and nutrient loss. So if excess water use has been shown to decrease yields in some recent studies, it also increases drainage and nutrient loss. It also reduces our ability to take advantage of free irrigation. But also there are implications of not having enough irrigation. If someone has invested in the infrastructure, it makes it less affordable, and it has been shown to decrease yields. So the drivers for us to improve efficiency, Council has worked on efficiency for many years, but the most recent drivers are now the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management. So Policy 3 and Policy 11 are the key areas which indicate that we should focus on the effects and use and development of land on whole of catchment basis, and using phrases like allocated and used efficiently. From a regional level, the notified tank plan change in Rule 46 and 47, that highlights the need for us to efficiently manage and allocate water. And in the Tuki Plan Change 6, which is operative, farm environmental plans are our key leverage for achieving greater level of efficiency. So, key work done to date, just on irrigation efficiency. We have, since 2009-2010, worked with water user groups, myself and the previous team. But prior to that, there were other staff members, Andrew Curtis, who you all know, who did initiate a number of irrigation groups. In 2017 to 19, we did run the irrigation checkup program, where we checked over 60 irrigation systems for performance, and provided irrigators with feedback on how their systems were operating, and pointed them in the directions they needed to, if they needed to do any repairs to their system if it wasn't functioning to a good standard. So this, along with some other groups that we ran, helped to highlight what areas we need to focus on for improving efficiency in the region. And fixing leaks was one of the campaigns that we did. You will not have seen this. It was unlikely to have seen this. It was targeted directly at irrigators, so it didn't go in the public arena. But it also had links to the Saving H2O is the Way to Go campaign that we ran, and which will come up next. And we did a series of articles on some background stories on irrigation, so focusing on, say, the recycling of water through the Watties plant, and there's a tool called the pressure bomb that has shown to reduce water use quite significantly. And the Saving H2O is the Way to Go campaign that was for municipal supply. We've also worked on the irrigation, IrriCalc calibration to help guide consent applications. And we've also ran some programs checking what the effects of maintenance are on performance. And we have most recently worked on refining the requirements for the irrigation, for the farm environmental management plans for irrigation. So that will be rolled out in the near future. We are just holding off until we have our FEMP manager sitting behind the desk before we finalise that. So future focus. This is largely industry and capacity building to ensure that there are standards in place, and working with industry to develop that capacity. As you'll see in the paper, there is currently limited ability for industry to provide advice on the environmental impacts of irrigation. There's a lot of advice as far as designing and installing, but when it comes to the environmental impacts that you need to be able to assess for FEMPs, that is limited currently. So we would also like to develop a certification program for assessing irrigation performance. This would either be done by ourselves or potentially alongside Irrigation New Zealand. And we would also like to work with, we also intend on working with the local industry, promoting them to become accredited irrigation companies, which would be in the FEMP requirements. As that is a 2-year, I understand it, they get accreditation for a 2-year period, and then they have to go through a re-accreditation program, which gives us the leverage to be able to ensure that they are continually meeting the standards that they need to. At a farm scale, some of the areas that we would like to we will focus on is increasing irrigation system performance where possible, and working with irrigators on robust irrigation decision making. So that's when you schedule your irrigation, and encourage the effective use of appropriate technology. Because sometimes technology comes out and it sounds like the bee's knees, but if it's not used in the right place at the right time, it's not going to assist. So we currently are working with Tom Skirman with the Regional Water Security Program. We are drafting a paper at the moment or a brief at the moment to extrapolate some of the data that we have established in the region, so that we can get a region-wide understanding of what the potential water savings can be with different irrigation systems and different crop types. And this will help to inform longer-term direction and resourcing. We have let the Saving H2O is the Way to Go campaign possibly run its course, and it's due for a refresh, and so we will reinitiate working with the TLAs and our comms team on re-establishing a new campaign. We'll go backwards. There we go. That's there just in case.
Thank you. Thank you both. Do we have any questions for Monique or Brendan? Yeah, Councillor Graham.
I'm really interested in efficiency and irrigation efficiency, because clearly there's some really good farmers and horticulturists doing it, and equally there's some people not doing such a good job. So how do we monitor that, and how do we get to the ones? Because a huge amount of savings can be gained in our water by having really efficient systems.
Yes, at this stage, the mechanism we've identified as being the best way for us to increase efficiency is through the farm environmental management plans. But we do also have, I should have said earlier, we do also have to realise that sometimes by improving an irrigation system, it doesn't always automatically mean that you are going to be saving water. Sometimes the systems, if they've got blockages, they may end up, once they have had maintenance done, they may actually use more water.
Councillor Curtin?
Thanks, Madam Chair. Can you just remind me of the global water, or the total water take, what the, if you like, the urban or municipal take is versus the rural? Can you just remind me of that figure? Do you know?
I don't have that at hand.
Don't know that off the top of our heads, but we can get back to you with
90-10, where sort of a 90.
I think it's about 30%.
Is it 30%, something like that? No? All right.
Well, Madam Chair?
Okay, well, yep, we'll just, would
Sure.
you like that answer given to you after?
Sheriff will know that.
Oh, you have the answer?
Yeah, so it all depends on which season we're talking about.
In the summer.
So we've got consented volumes and we actually got actual use. So urban area uses, and we're not quite sure what it is in the tank catchment that we talked about, but we're thinking and they can't actually tell us the answer. It's about 60 to 70 million cubic metres for urban area, for urban use. And horticulture, we can go almost 80 cubic metres, million cubic metres. So we are in a fully used year. We're using just a little bit more than the urban area.
Okay, so it's a relatively big number for the urban environment.
It is.
Big number.
So it's just going to there, and I note your. I just wanted to take you to the general water savings in the wider community, and ask a question around conservation messaging in that setting. And would it be right to add in the subsidy that we apply for tank storage, etc., that's available to with our loan scheme, or is that relevant to this?
Potentially, we're about to bring together the TLAs and our comms team, and that can be brought up as part of the discussion.
All right. So here's my question: is what conversations are being had with the TAs about their infrastructure for conservation, water conservation, and have we submitted on their long-term plan to that effect? What advice are we giving our TA counterparts around conserving water?
So I can answer that. So the first thing is within the tank policies, there are specific policies relating. I was actually just happened to be reading it for another reason just a few moments ago. That does require working collaboratively with Napier and Hastings District Councils to develop an integrated approach to planning within finite resources, and a bunch of things around water use efficiency, industry good practice, requiring in their demand and supply management plans there to be infrastructure leakage solutions, etc. So first thing to say is in the tank policies, which we've worked collaboratively with Napier and Hastings to draft, there's a bunch of requirements on us not only to continue working together, but for them to take a number of steps to manage the efficiency of their network, including demand. We have just submitted in the last day a submission on the Hastings District Council long-term plan that references these policies and our view about the adequacy of what's in their long-term plan on this very topic, and we're going to circulate that to Council in the next day or so. We've also just finalising a submission on the Napier City Council long-term plan that similarly addresses that. So the very things that you're seeking some comfort on, I can assure you we're doing.
Thank you. Great answer.
Councillor Williams.
That was my question, is what levers we had for urban water efficiency, so thank you.
Councillor Lambert.
Yeah, I noticed in 6.2 about policy 11, fresh water is allocated and used efficiently. All existing over-allocations phased out and future over-allocation is avoided. Where are we at with that?
Sorry, where are we?
Tank.
So that's that one there.
Policy 11.
So that's a requirement, that's a clause in a national policy statement, the recently released national policy statement, where that in practice comes to play is as we develop our regional policy in response to that, those requirements will be met. So Kotahi, for example, Tank is actually already ahead of that. It's dealing with allocation issues and prescribing or proposing new allocation issues.
Under the council policies?
Under our regional plans, yes. So the national policy says you must do these things.
Yeah.
We then give effect to that by writing regional policy, rules, etc., to deal with those.
Well, how do you know what's being over-allocated?
Well, so that's done through our both a combination of our science work to determine, well, what are the limits, what's the available allocation, and then through our regulatory consenting work, what's on paper, what's allocated, and is there a difference? Put simply, have you provided more than the system can cope with? So it's a combination of science to understand and support limit setting for the policy, and then for the policy to, if needed, wind back or claw back those allocations from consent holders.
That's just going to bring me back to my other question then. It's like, hey, what have we done about that? Have we identified that and we're actioning it?
So in tank, yes, that's part of it's a kind of a core component to the tank work, for example. You've stopped allocating any more extra. So unfortunately, Katrina's not here, but yes, so the answer is yes. And in Tuki Tuki, that was again a central part of the Tuki Tuki policy. And then as Mohaka, Kotahi, as other policy programs roll out, those very conversations will carry on and occur across communities. So it's a point in time.
Councillor Barker.
Back to Councillor Curtin and the Chief Executive's conversation. Isn't the problem for dealing with urban water slightly more complicated than that? In that doesn't the law provide for councils to draw up water without almost any limit for human consumption?
No. What is true for both the Resource Management Act by way of primary legislation and also the National Policy Statement, and also with respect to the policies contained within the notified tank plan change, is that supply for municipal purposes is a high priority. The introduction of Te Mana o Te Wai in the latest National Policy Statement creates a hierarchy that places the environment ahead of the needs of people. The limit setting within the tank plan change very much is explicit that those allocations, while they're a priority for municipal purposes, still has to occur within the limits overall set. And so what the policies aim to do is encourage the territorial authorities to prioritise efficiencies on the demand side, efficiencies within their network, particularly with respect to losses, by effectively capping their future allocations.
So that's the national policy statements to change the environment significantly there.
So TANK was already heading in that direction, and the latest MPS makes it even clearer.
Okay, that's
Councillor
good.
Foss.
Thank you.
Thanks. Could you just pop back to it's one of your first slides, the programs you ran, and that was the fix the leak kind of thing. Given that, picking up on the municipal side of things again, so that's about 50% of the entire kind of consented take, roughly, over a year. Do you have any data or knowledge on how much is lost in leaks via municipal infrastructure? We just hear different stories, and you know, if it was an irrigator, we're trying to get more efficient sprinklers and stuff like that. That's great.
My role is largely focused on irrigation. I do a very small amount on municipal, but you have
Yeah,
some
so it's
information
just
on
over
leak index.
20%, I think, for both Napier and Hastings.
Oh, so about 20% of the water they do take actually is lost via leakage.
So it's a bit more complex than that. So it's non-revenue water, so it can be lost through mismatch metering. It can be lost in theory. It can be physically lost, and there's always and things like firefighting. It's being used, standpipes, etc. So it's not just physically lost, but they're the numbers. And there's an annual report that Water New Zealand do for most municipal water suppliers that ranks all the various suppliers.
And where does Hawke's Bay rank?
I'd say at the not at the better end.
But again, the point being, and I appreciate you most on irrigation, absolutely fine, but there's only some, we keep using the term over-allocation and then efficiencies. Everyone's pretty much on board with that bus, that's fine. But 15 or 25% or 20 is a very significant number.
Yep.
And so, okay, well, it's very interesting knowledge, I guess. And then it's one, I guess, we take up with the advocacy role that you were talking about before with their long-term plans, I presume. That's part of that conversation as well, because their infrastructure, there's a lot of discussions going on around Three Waters right now.
And limit setting. So to the point that Councillor Barker was making, previously it was easy enough for the municipal suppliers here to simply draw more water than spend the money on fixing the pipes. By creating a cap and no further allocation to meet their community's growth objectives, they've now got to make different decisions, and what will be the lowest cost option, the next lowest cost option in a limited environment will be fixing the leakages.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Van Pijk.
Yeah, first question to you, Monique, and thank you very much for your presentation. And I've been involved in all of that work that you've done, and I think it really has highlighted the issues that we as a primary industry were facing in the irrigation space. And a lot of the 60 that you possibly tested and gave advice to would have been very surprised how poor actually they knew how their system worked. So I think it's been really good work from the Hawke Regional Council to have done this work. And the primary sector definitely has taken it further. So that's efficiency of irrigation. How many of irrigators actually are able to verify the amount of water that they use accurately? And not just going there on a daily basis and do a reading, but actually that it actually comes directly to us as council. Have you got visibility of that?
That's Joe Rogers that has that data. Yeah.
So you can't say whether it's 50% or 100% of all our water takes are now telemetry, and those meters are verified by blue tick operators.
It varies from region to region. I know that.
So look, we can provide you all that information. So Joe Rogers' team, Water Information Services, that doesn't sit with these guys are the kind of data managers. So we can give you all the stats on numbers of metres, telemetry. Typically, policy prescribes in our sensitive catchments that they need to be metered and telemetered. Uptake has been really, really high. There was a whole process of verification that's developed and has continued, accredited installers. So it's a reasonably advanced area of our work and going pretty well. So maybe we even bring you back a bit of a view on what we're doing in the water information services space for the next committee meeting.
Because I think that's very important. Unless you measure, you can't manage. And that's really what it comes down to. And a subsequent question to that, how many of our water users in the urban space know what they use? And the estimate was at the water crisis in Havelock North was over 700 litres per person per day. And Auckland, who actually has got water meters, they were down to 225. So once again, if you measure if urban people would measure, they'd be shocked. And actually, you see some quite amazing change in their behaviour. We're already seeing it in the landscape now that they're changing their behaviour, but it will be greater. So just as a point.
Thank you. Councillor Foley, last question.
Thanks, Chair. So last year, phone was always going red hot with water issues. A lot of tension around people that their systems were failing and irrigators still going flat tack. A common call that I got, and just to know, do we have a team that get these calls too, is around the irrigators going during the 30-degree day with a driving westerly, and as you drive along, you just see the water going that way rather than down there. Do you want to comment on that? Because I know the irrigators themselves say that it's all been tested and it's fine, it's working, but it certainly doesn't look like I get the people ringing, it doesn't look good.
Yeah, it doesn't look good, and that's where some of the FEMP requirements on justifying when you irrigate will be quite important. Initially, they were talking about the evaporation of that water being approximately around 3%. The newer studies are suggesting more around 5%. So that does put it into a slightly more significant realm. And it is something that we will need to work on. The unfortunate reality with some systems and how irrigation systems are designed is that if you're trying to get around your whole property, you can quite often be under time pressure and you're almost forced to irrigate. But if it's going sideways, you're irrigating the neighbours and not your property. So we're not necessarily receiving any benefit from it. So yes, certainly justifying irrigation in your FEMPs and having a plan for that will be quite important.
Councillor Curtin.
Happy to move, Madam Chair, the receipt of the report.
Would you like to second, Councillor Lambert?
Yes.
You can talk as a seconder.
Guys, got a question.
Councillor Curtin.
Yeah, well, thank you. Very, very briefly, thanks for the report, Monique, and thanks to the team for the really solid work that we're doing. It's a leadership role that we ought to, or we continue to provide, lead the way on. And clearly we are in with the irrigator space. We're doing some good work there. I'd be really keen on hearing a little bit more about the engagement with the TAs, and the Chief Executive's indicated that not only are we, but we've got that responsibility to do that in legislation. So very keen to see that. But it does highlight for me the leadership role that this council, the tools that it's got to play, if you like, an instructive, advisory, if you like, the professional and or expert role in managing water. And clearly that's our space to be in. The engagement with the TAs is a critical part of that as a leader in that space. And I think we saw with the urban waterways this morning presentation in that environment that we can lead the way, we can be collaborative, and we can start to get momentum going. And I think the numbers speak for themselves. If we're able to save, for example, just a few percentage points on both in the if you like the irrigated sector and or the urban sector, well, we are making progress. So good on that. There's just one final thing I'd be interested to get some feedback at some point on is the concept of what's called purple pipes. which is returning water from stored stormwater, for example, back into the system in the urban environment particularly, to use on the car or the garden, etc., and whether in fact we can initiate with the TAs a program that looks like that. So I'd be interested to get some feedback on that. Thank you.
Okay. Councillor Lambert, I'm aware you had a question, but you had a question not so long ago, so you can speak as the seconder.
Yeah, obviously water is such an important commodity, and it's still fresh in my mind about the publicity that was put out about 10 years ago with the people down at Bridge Park. Yeah, and to them they saw it as inequity of allocation. So I do notice the words that they use in the policy, the government policy, that all existing over-allocation is phased out, and I really sort of like to see us use similar language to what the government uses, so I can sort of make a relationship between what you're doing and what we're supposed to be doing. One of the other things I know we've been talked a lot about in the council is the recharge projects and how that affects part of the system that it makes water efficiency. Helps us make more efficient use of our water. So I think the recharge system should be part of this project somehow. But thanks for the presentation. There are a lot of all the work you're doing to date that hasn't been put in the same slide as before. So it's good to see that. And there is a lot of people getting involved. So thank you for that. And I think your time frame's been doing it for a long time, and people have been running out for a long time, so we're going to have to come to a balance sooner or later.
Thank you. Any other speakers? Okay. I'll put that to the table that we receive this update. All those who agree say aye.
Aye.
Those against? Thank you. Carried. Thank you very much. We're moving on to our next item, item 15. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Bruce Clarkson.
I'm sorry, I have to leave.
Yes. Thank you. Have a safe trip. And Dr. Clarkson's here based on a fantastic presentation around biodiversity and climate change that he gave to the Hastings District Council. And we thought it would be of value for him to share his research, but also the direction moving forward. So when you're ready, Mr. Clarkson, thank you.
Kia ora tātou. Good to be here today. I've been here several times. My main family connection to the Hawke's Bay is with the Erehas of Porangaho. And I'm here as well on this visit to see some of them who are not that well and are in Hastings Hospital. But I was pleased to be asked to come. Thank you, Henry. And talk a little bit about, I guess, mainly biodiversity, but also because biodiversity and climate change are both wicked problems, at times talk about the interaction between the two of them and try to get across the notion that actually if we could fix biodiversity, we're going to be doing a lot of good for climate change as well. We'll just see if this one works. Yes, it does. So I'm just going to cover three main sections in my talk. I'll go through a little bit of background about the Hawke's Bay biodiversity and some key ecological principles. I'm going to really focus on urban centres and the impact of urban dwellers on the environment and how they can be part of the solution to reverse biodiversity decline. And I'm going to try and conclude with an optimistic future because at the moment actually in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we have the best policy framework available that we've had in 40 years. And I know that because I've been around for that long and been working in this space for at least that long. So I'm sure you're all aware that the International Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services put in their final report recently, their updated report on the state of biodiversity in the world, and we are no different to the rest of the world. Biodiversity is in dangerous decline, species extinction rates are accelerating, and the main point of that report was that our response, both nationally and internationally, is essentially insufficient to turn the tide at the moment. And so the question is, what are we going to do about it? And I won't spend long telling you about the woes of biodiversity, apart from really trying to focus in on what I think we can do to help fix the problem. I'm more interested in actually fixing the problem. And part of fixing the problem is knowing where the biggest issues lie. And of course, you know, we all know, and I'm a farmer's son, I know this extremely well, that the areas of New Zealand that were the richest in Indigenous biodiversity were clearly the ones that were targeted for agricultural development, and there's a good reason for that, because that biodiversity richness was intimately linked to the best soils, the best drainage conditions, the mildest climates in the country. And the land care research, Manaaki Whenua Land Care Research Threatened Environment Classification shows this really well. Here we have a colour-coded system showing the extent of loss of Indigenous cover in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and it's pretty obvious where the red zone is. I always joke with my family that I've spent most of my life trying to turn the red zone into the green zone, and coming from a farming family, sometimes that has been an interesting discussion. So Hawke's Bay is no different to any other part of the country in the sense that, you know, the impacts clearly are in the coastal and lowland zone. That's where the greatest amount of removal of Indigenous biodiversity has occurred. And the uplands is the place where we've set aside the biggest chunks of what we're calling reserve, conservation reserve. And of course, those valuable tracts of native forest and tussock land in the Kaweka and other places are very important, but it's really important also to recognise that they're not actually representative of the full range of Indigenous biodiversity that was on the landscape. And for that biodiversity to survive in the long term, an approach that is really required is a one ecosystem approach, because ecosystems in Hawke's Bay and the rest of the country were always coupled. They were coupled systems of land and water operating in interdependent ways, and part of the issue for restoring biodiversity is how we reconnect that coupling between land and water, how we take a one ecosystem approach, basically. Now, in most of the private farmland in the Hawke's Bay, of course, we have QE2 National Trust working extremely effectively with the farming community and setting aside pieces of private land that have very high biodiversity values. They're shown there on the map, the little yellow bits and pieces scattered across the landscape. And the data I think I've got on there is slightly out of date now. It's dated July 2019. At that stage, there were 251 registered covenants. I believe it's up to about almost 260 now. And the total area protected on that private lands is just over 10,000 hectares. The thing to focus in on, though, is the size of those patches and the question that raises about what is needed to ensure permanency on the landscape, an enduring result for Indigenous biodiversity, if you like. The average size of those patches is about 43 hectares, but the median size is only 10 hectares. So they're very tiny patches, and they're widely scattered across the landscape. And so the question is, you know, what can we do, I guess, to stitch it back together? Because we do need to reconnect it and stitch it back together if we want an enduring result for these small patches. And the key to it, of course, is connectivity and configuration, and the riparian planting that's going on in Hawke's Bay is a great start. From the point of view, though, of biodiversity, the corridors that are currently being established would be viewed as the bare minimum response and not of enough magnitude to make a permanent difference. Yes, the riparian planting is great for things like water quality, but biodiversity corridors are a different matter altogether. And so the question is, what would we need to do to fix that. The reason I say this, in taking the one ecosystem view, it's really important to remember that the original landscapes of New Zealand were coupled in ways that we can only hardly think about today. The early Polynesian settlers noticed this really early on because they knew to track birds along altitudinal gradients if they wanted to harvest and live from the Kiruru, for example. Flowers and fruiting, which are the key drivers for our native birds, for example, things flower earlier, closer to the coast. They flower later at high altitude. And the native birds originally migrated from the coast to the alpine areas following the food source through the year. And it was like a smorgasbord elevator that occurred across the landscape. You just kept moving across and following the food. And those migratory patterns were particularly important. So, when we're thinking about putting biodiversity back together on the landscape, we've got to really think big. We've got to really think about these interdependencies and relationships. And the small patches of Kiwi2 are a great start. But the question that I'm posing today is, planting woods for riparian depend entirely on what you're trying to achieve. If you're trying to achieve, keeping your stock out of the waterway, that's one thing. If you're trying to achieve a corridor that will allow bird migration or movement of plant propagules, that's another. And I put the big green bar at the bottom, not because I know the answer, because the answer actually is different for every organism. And when people are thinking about fixing a landscape, they need to be thinking about what is the width of corridor needed. Am I targeting movement of Kiruru? Am I targeting some invertebrate? Am I interested in how I maintain a plant community? Because the answer will be different for every organism group that we focus on. The main point, though, that I wanted to make again, though, is that many patches are just too small. And this is an example from near the Tukituki River, where one of the smallest reserves known to humankind has been created. And it was done for a very good reason. In this little patch is a single plant of a very threatened native shrub or small tree, Pittosporum obcordatum. That's its picture there, the flower there. And of course, it's highly threatened, and yes, this certainly protects it from stock, but the reproductive status of this plant is, well, these plants are dioecious. They have separate male and female plants. This one's a male, and there are no females for miles. So the question
Frustrated.
is, more than frustrated, you will not get an enduring result. You will not get descendants this way. This is not the way you get descendants. So again, I'm just making this point about the necessity to focus in on size and reconnection. And over the years, because as I've got older and slower and started taking more notice of my own backyard and living in the city now and not in the country, I have started to realise that, part of the issue here is that cities, of course, drive a lot of the consumption and resource use. I was interested in the line of questioning I detected before on irrigation. The point here is that if cities could get their act together, cities could actually drive part of the solution. So I've tried to tip the problem on its head and think about it in a different way. A famous UK planner, Sir Patrick Geddes, in 1914 said, it takes a whole region to make a city, because you're concentrating the resources and utilising the resources and building up this urban environment. Well, flip it on its head. It takes a whole city to reverse biodiversity decline in a region. I think this is the key point, and I'm going to get to a little bit more of this as I get through my talk. So Napier then is my focus here to begin with, and this is a graph, just a simple graph, and notice that the x-axis is not entirely linear in order to squeeze it onto the graph there. But what it does show is, like most cities in New Zealand, obviously where the most intense development is, you fully remove indigenous biodiversity. And as you move out from the centre of a city, you increasingly see an increase, if you like, in the extent of indigenous cover. I'm using vegetation cover here as a surrogate for biodiversity. It's not a bad surrogate, but it's not a perfect surrogate. And of course, Napier is one of 7 cities in New Zealand that has the lowest amount of Indigenous biodiversity of the biggest 20 urban centres in New Zealand because, well, mainly because of the gentle terrain and the ease with which early European settlers removed native vegetation. I come from another, I call it the Type A curve. I live in a Type A curve city. Kirikiriroa, Hamilton is the same. Hastings is the same. Christchurch is the same. The best city in New Zealand in terms of retaining its Indigenous cover, if you like, is actually New Plymouth in Taranaki, which has almost 9% of Indigenous cover within the built-up matrix of the city, which is a historical artefact of a combination of rough terrain, gullies, and a scenery preservation society of early European settlers that set large chunks of forest aside, including, if you visit New Plymouth, you may have gone to Pukekura Park or Huatoki Domain or Ratapihi Domain, amazing Indigenous habitat still remaining in a built-up matrix. So the question again I come back to is, well, what are we going to do about this, and why are we going to need to do something? We were involved in the development of the National Policy Statement on Indigenous Biodiversity, which is going to be ratified this year. And within that document, one of the implementation targets in that National Policy Statement, restoring Indigenous biodiversity, depleted environments, a target for Indigenous cover, which in urban areas and peri-urban areas must be at least 10%. That's a really challenging target for the 7 Type A cities. It won't be much of a target for New Plymouth, and there's a whole lot of intermediates in between, like Nelson and Wellington, that won't have too great a difficulty achieving that. But the reason for this is scientifically based. It's not just a figure plucked out of the air. And notice that the figure is given as a minimum, not as a final definitive target, but as a minimum. And the research on which this is based, well, there's massive amount of international research, best exemplified by the work of Hansky, a Finnish ecologist. It applies in our country exactly the same. Species area curves and fragmentation of biodiversity. When you get below 10%, you basically have an exponential loss of species regardless of things like pests. So, you know, a lot of people talk a lot about pests and their impact on native birds, and yes, that is serious. But you know what? There's a more fundamental thing still going on the landscape, and that is that when we reduce cover to below 10%, the chances of survival of nearly, well, literally 90% of the flora and fauna is massively compromised. And so there's a good amount of research around that demonstrates this, and basically anything we can do to bring levels of cover back towards that 10% minimum can have really important consequences, really significant positive consequences. So I wanted to now share with you a little bit of work that we did with Napier City Council recently, last year, the year before, where we surveyed Napier City to see what was left in terms of biodiversity, because actually, even though it's got that below 10% threshold in the built-up matrix, the question is, what is actually within the city boundary? And the answer, of course, is more than most people realise. There's quite a lot of hidden biodiversity, if you like, and this survey uncovered, not all of it, I would say, but a really good proportion of it. It's really hard to, you know, get the detail of survey required to find every last example of everything that's still left on the landscape. So within the Napier City, 628 hectares at least of what could be defined as significant natural area using the RMA definition as advocated by the Chief Judge, Judge Bollard. Then the issue again, though, is that these are very small patches. Notice the median SNA size within Napier City, 1.54 hectares. But notice the figure at the bottom. Of the total city area, about 5.9 or possibly almost 6% of the city does have still retained within it indigenous vegetation where there is vegetation where there is dominance by indigenous species. And it'd be no surprise to those of you who live here where most of that is concentrated. The saline plain, Ahuriri, obviously, is 90%, more than 90% of the total SNA area. And the way to look at these, again, thinking about how you can reconnect things on the landscape, is to look at them in terms of being nuclei for restoration. Nuclei, places where you can start to reconnect, particularly along waterways and other public lands, where you might be able to bring back something of that continuity needed, that connection needed to maintain these features on the landscape. So they're all numbered there. They're probably a bit hard to spot on that diagram, but you can see where the focus is here again on the Ahuriri. Ahuriri has enormous potential to be the flagship for native vegetation and the habitat that supports all of those amazing birds that are also found in that system. So we helped develop a little GIS program, an algorithm that searches the landscape for the best places to make these connections. And here the rules were essentially public land first. Can you do it using the existing public land resource? And if you can, where are the closest places that could be reconnected? So this is a map of the potential for connectivity across Napier, and the more green the colour is on the picture there, the better. And again, you can see where this is going. You know, obviously Ahuriri is the place where the focus can be, and by utilising existing public lands and thinking about how you can do revegetation and restoration, these are the potential best places in Napier City. And that brings me to Ahuriri again, because obviously there is already an estuary and coastal edge master plan, and the question is, you know, how is this going to be progressed? And I am at least aware that in your LTP that you've been talking somewhat about this, and my only advice would be, well, yes, please get on with it. This is the place, and this is the place where you can take the 6% and go for the 10% that's in the National Policy Statement by doing some of the reconnection that was illustrated in that potential connectivity map. I'm sorry. It's important, though, to think about how this is done, because reconstruction of ecosystems is not the same as revegetation. It's not the same as planting up a park with a few trees. It does need to be thought about in a very systematic way, and these are the attributes of real ecosystem reconstruction. These are the sorts of things that I've been helping with in many parts of the country already. You need to know about what is the target you're going for, what are the full assemblages and species occupancy that you can achieve, and that you're building habitat for all components of the system, not just bringing back native birds as much as we all love them. Well, in Napier, of course, there has been a start made, and there's some pretty interesting bits of urban forests scattered around in Napier. And again, I'm thinking again in terms of potential. If you're going to start somewhere, you start where you've got an existing nucleus, and you try and expand and build out from that nucleus. And these are just a few of the examples of places around Napier that we've worked in to see what's still there, and they certainly have enormous potential. I wanted to particularly highlight one place, though, Friends Bush out Taradale Way, because this place, which is created by Colin, I think his name, Colin Wilson, over a 35-year period, is the model example of what can be achieved in a dry Hawke's Bay climate. And it proves actually that you can reconstruct ecosystems. You can do more than just revegetation. So about 35 years ago, he started working here. It's only about an acre And he made every mistake. He freely admits everybody who gets into restoration makes mistakes, but along the way he's learnt what works and has created an amazing patch of bush in his own backyard, basically. And this, again, is just trying to make that point that when people say to you, oh, you can't do this, don't believe them. You can. It just takes an understanding of how you reconstruct an ecosystem, and there is now a lot of technical data available that can help support processes like this. People always say to me too, oh, Hawke's Bay, it's not the Waikato, it's not Taranaki, you don't think you can just grow bush. Well, of course I understand that. I am aware of these things. And but what I wanted to put as a counter to you, of course, is that the Hawke's Bay flora has within it a range of pre-adapted plants, native plants that have been living on this landscape for literally tens of thousands of years. And they have been adapting to this system, and they are capable of surviving. All you've got to do is give them half a chance, really. They are things like the narrow-leaved lacebark Hoheria, the coprosma, the tangling divaricate coprosma virescens, and then there's a whole bunch of them, including the one on the left there, that lone male that I showed you before. They are perfect for drier environments on low river terraces, and you can basically use this matrix of ingredients to put them back together to create new native vegetation, new plant communities, new habitat for animals. I wanted to now sort of move into, I guess, some of the optimistic end of my talk, because, this is not new, and it is happening now all over the country. Lots of people are addressing these issues, and by addressing, I'll make this point again, by addressing the biodiversity issue, you are also addressing the issue of how you adapt and mitigate in relation to climate change. Planting trees is a damn good thing for climate mitigation. Wellington, New Zealand's first biophilic city, I think, is leading the way. They've got about 97 projects in total going on across the city, and the flagship project, of course, is that famous sanctuary, Zealandia, where they've got the predator-proof fence around Zealandia, just over 250 hectares, fully protected, all of the predators removed, except for mice. Mice keep popping in and out occasionally, but, there are no possums and no rats and no stoats and no weasels, and the birds are thriving. And the biggest benefit there has been the spillover of native birds from the sanctuary into the surrounding areas. And then in recent times was Predator Free New Zealand project and all of the community groups that are out there now trapping mice and possums and all the rest. The birds are no longer doomed to death when they fly across the fence, right? As you bring the predator numbers down in the wider landscape, the bird communities will continue to persist and survive. So Wellington's doing lots of stuff, and they're going to get to that 10% reasonably soon. New Plymouth is really biting the bullet at the moment. I was at the council meeting where they ratified the 10% target about 2 months ago. Of course, they're lucky. They've only got to recreate 34 hectares and they're at 10%. So it's all very well. But, they're not going to stop there, and they do understand, because they want to be in that premier position of leadership and be able to say to the rest of the world, look, actually, we've not only got to the 10%, but we're going further. And they're doing that by working on some very significant corridor projects. This is one here, the river that skirts the edge of the Taranaki ring plain, the Waiwakaiho, which runs up through here, up towards Te Papakura or Taranaki, once known as Egmont National Park. The river flows down right around the edge of the ring plain and out just near Bell Block in New Plymouth, Ngā and if you've been on the coastal walkway in New Plymouth, you're right near where that river flows out. Well, the focus in New Plymouth is on the big corridor, the corridor that will reconnect the city to the national park, and work has already started. They're growing the plants right now. They've built the infrastructure, the community infrastructure of nurseries for native plants. They've got volunteer labour force of a size you could only imagine. I mean, I've just been blown away by the number of people who've signed up to want to be able to help with this stuff. And so they will, in the next 20 years, and they're realistic here. They're thinking long term. You know, you can't recreate and reverse something that took 200 years of hard work by people clearing forest, basically since the 1920s. It's going to take time to put these things back on the landscape, but it is an eminently achievable goal. And so in New Plymouth, they're working on the Waiwakaia corridor, and they're over the other side of the Maunga, out on the west. I can't show you them all. They've got a couple of corridors out there that they're working on too. And the big corridor in the national park is the one that stretches out to here, the Kaitaki Range, where they've now got the biggest community group predator-free project in Taranaki, and they're working on the corridor that will link this part of the park to the ocean. So you can see there's a lot of work going on in New Plymouth. Tauranga, they're all on board. Tauranga, if you've been to Tauranga lately, if you drive in on the main motorway heading into town, the toll road, look to your right, and there's a really big corridor there called the Kopu Ererua Valley Restoration, where the city has put aside about nearly 300 hectares of what has been grazing land of late, and they are turning that back into an ecological corridor. Again, that will stretch all the way from the headwaters of the Kopu Ererua stream right out to the salt marshes of the coast. And Tauranga also has, of course, many other really interesting projects going on. Moao, or the Mount, you will know it as possibly, Moao Historic Reserve, and the work going on there to reclothe that land, that mountain feature, the Rhyolite Dome, with forest, and all of the work going on in some of the estuarine and salt marsh communities. So Tauranga City is in this in a big way as well. They have about 5%, and they haven't actually adopted the 10% yet, but there's a huge debate going on at the moment over there, and I wouldn't be surprised if that happens very shortly. And then the other example I wanted to just show you is, of course, is Christchurch. Back in 2006, I did these calculations on the 10% target for every one of the 20 main urban centres in New Zealand, and Christchurch was the one that had the biggest shortfall. Well, you know, I shouldn't have done it really, because you know what happened in 2012. So the two big earthquakes in essentially one coordinated natural event suddenly created the opportunity for the new corridor in Christchurch. So the liquefaction of the land that was formerly wetland, that probably should never have been built on, and this is the other message in all of this work, by the way, listening to nature, working with nature, not always working against nature, understanding the messages that nature is giving us and making the most of those opportunities. So the liquefaction zone, the red zone, only recently, I think less than 3 months ago, the government signed over the red zone back to Christchurch City, and in the stroke of a pen provided the opportunity of a 600-hectare ecological corridor known as the Avon-Otakara Ecological Corridor, which will go all the way out to the ocean.
That's fantastic, isn't it?
So I want to, I guess I am close to starting the wrap-up, if you like. I just wanted to make that point about cities, urban centres, because they are the nexus of the opportunity. These are the places where clearly this is where the people are, and if you want to retain that connection with nature, it should be in their own backyard. Most people, I have to say honestly to you, very few people here in Napier visit the Kaiweka Range, right? So where are they going to get their nature experience? Their nature experience is something they best experience in places like Ahuriri and all of the reserves here, but in a much more comprehensive way than what is available now. So the opportunities that urban centres present, the lack of grazing animals, you can't overestimate the significance of that. You're not having to fight the sheep and the cattle to maintain your habitat. And some of those terrible predators too are in lower abundances in city environments, stoats and weasels, for example. They are around, but nowhere near to the extent of the problem in the rural sector. And so, you know, the cities have often that resource in terms of labour, volunteer labour, and they have, let's face it, they've got the cash too. So bringing it all together, all of the expertise, all of these things, I think cities are the key to regional scale transformation. It shouldn't be just looking out to the back and to the farming community and expecting it all to happen out there. Actually, it's about a coordinated, integrated approach to bring this together, to make the transformation needed for biodiversity. And to remember that it's not just about biodiversity. Yes, we are getting the biodiversity gain, but by doing these things, we get all of those other benefits. And in serious times of heating of urban centres, which is happening in a way, you had your highest temperature in Napier for a May how many days ago was that? Yesterday. Was it yesterday?
2 days ago.
Yeah. Well, you know, you want to cool the city down. The best way to do this is to have more urban indigenous forest on the landscape. That dampens the temperature and improves situations. To build the corridors, not just with the sense of the ecology and bringing the biodiversity back, but co-use corridors, you know, for recreation, walkways, all of those things can be designed to be done in an integrated way. In Kurikuriarai Hamilton, the biggest thing that I've found with these sorts of projects is the social cohesion that it brings. You know, when you get people to work together for a common purpose, it's massive community building. It's incredibly good for society. And coming back again to helping climate change, more trees, more carbon sequestration, and then more recently we've become aware of the benefit, the health and recreational benefits of high quality nature in urban centres. And this is not just the feel-good factor, by the way. The research internationally is now demonstrating a causal link to health through having good quality green space in your backyard, the connection between your gut biome, gut microbiome, and the microbiome of the soil and the air around high-quality green space is a fundamental driver of good health of human beings. I can give you all the detail if you want to know, but this is a serious proposition, and the research is really coming home to show the causal linkage. For asthma in New Zealand, it's been known for some time that the best way to reduce the proportion of children with asthma in the population is to have less grassland and more forest near your home, more parkland with trees, not the trees that are of the style of the birch and the privet, which will make things worse, but native species which will actually improve your health benefit. So I wanted to conclude by just making a couple of observations around the best way to achieve this. I've been working around the country for about the last 15 years, watching this shift starting to occur in both human communities and in terms of restoration of biodiversity. And the important thing to remember is, though, most people sort of start talking about the natural ecosystem. Well, yeah, that is the thing which underpins our livelihoods and everything we're trying to achieve. But knowledge of the other ecosystems is vital if you're going to be successful in this space. Do you know who's out there already doing all of the work? Do you have a census of it? I hear you're going to hear a report a little bit after me, which is exactly this sort of census. Knowing about who's doing what, about how they can work closely together, how we can avoid duplication, but how we can plug gaps that people haven't thought about. How we can do this in a cooperative way. Sometimes we use the term collective impact. It's an increasingly more widely used term, collective impact. My experience in roaming around the country is that when people start getting these other bits right, then things really start happening. How we approach the funding ecosystem in a more careful and strategic and rational way, rather than having many groups out there all competing for the same small dollar. Thinking about ways that you can get the overlap and get the collaboration going to make this sort of stuff happen. And I think it's only when you start getting the leadership coming from within the community. And when I say community, I mean iwi and community. I mean all of those bits working collaboratively. The leadership needs to come from within the community to really achieve the level of implementation and transformation that is required to reverse the scale of biodiversity decline at a more appropriate level. At the moment, we are falling short, but we have, the opportunity presented by a much more favourable policy environment, and I think so. The time is coming, and when I say the favourable policy environment, there's just a little list of the things that have happened in the last while. I can't see that we've ever had a more favourable policy environment between predator-free New Zealand and new Indigenous biodiversity strategy, Te Uru Rako and the billion trees, which is now looking to up the number of native trees to approximately 15% of the total planted. Jobs for Nature, the next 4 years of funding, 1.3 billion, to get stuff on the land, done on the landscape. And so my take-home thought really for urban centres or cities is, if we can sort it out in cities, I think we can do it at regional scale. So thank you for listening, and if any questions, I'm happy to try and answer anyway.
Yeah, well, that was an amazing presentation, Bruce. Do we have any questions for Bruce? Up to the curtain.
So thank you very much. It's always a great inspiration to have you here, Clarkson. My question is around native species and the most accelerating revegetation into natives, and we've got this major call to utilise native species, but I've looked at some research around using Pinus radiata as a protective canopy for that purpose. Have you got a viewpoint on how we should approach, not so much the examples you've used, but more in the bigger scale?
Bigger scale, yeah. The biggest limiting factor in New Zealand at the moment is that I am unaware of a single region yet that has the infrastructure in place to provide the level of plant supply that we need to do this truly at regional scale. I know that people in Taranaki are currently working on trying to put together a coordinated community infrastructure which will allow this. The same sort of thing has been tried for some time in the Waikato, and they still haven't got there. So the biggest limitation is actually the plant supply. And so we are going to have to be pragmatic and practical at times about how we achieve some of the cover that we need to progress this process. The trick, though, is we just can't use trees like pine as monocultures. It's a given. If you're going to use them as part of a process where you transform a landscape and use a process of, I guess, what you might call management manipulation to progressively turn it back to native, you have to think very carefully about things like the spacing of trees, how much cover are they providing, how are you introducing the other ingredients, the native ingredients. Now, the Billion Trees project is already starting to grapple with some of this. I don't know whether you've come across a guy by the name of Adam Forbes, who comes out of your district here. He knows this stuff inside out. He's been working on this problem for some time, and it is a question of how you get the right balance. Yes, there may be places where you have no choice but to use things like pine. Personally, I am as a matter of first principle, I would say no, but I'm also very pragmatic. and I do know that until we solve some of these other infrastructure problems, we will have to use combinations. But we do need to think very carefully about the way the planting program occurs. And Adam is really a mine of information for your region for this sort of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess the QE2 trusts.
Yeah.
What sort of incentives are there for people to lock their land up like that?
What sort of incentive for?
What do they get out of it? Is there?
Yeah.
Do they sell their land, or do they find it over?
Yeah, well, this is a question I would ask of people who make policy in councils. So, what are the incentives? What are the policy incentives that are being built into the system to encourage people to do even more of it? Now, it is a fact that when you start looking very closely at the way QE2 operates, the people who tend to do it first are people who've made their way. You know, they've got the freehold land holding, and they've got to a stage, often in their generational stage, where, you know, a landowner is saying, what am I going to leave from all of the stuff that I've actually cleared, right? And what am I going to do? So there is a sort of a generational thing going on there. If you want to encourage more people to do it, there will need to be greater policy incentive. And the policy incentive may be things like rates relief. And the problem across New Zealand is that rates relief is done in a very disjunct way. So, for example, I'm based in the Waikato district, where if the piece of land you protect is less than 10 hectares, you get no rate relief. If you've got a piece that's greater than 10 hectares, you will. And if you go to the adjoining district, there is none anyway. So there is no coherent policy incentive often operating in some of these issues. And the question is, well, what are you guys doing as a council to provide the incentive? Because yes, some landowners can afford to do it, and they're usually well established. They've been there for generations. People who are still developing their land, or people who are, you know, new in the game, may not be in the same position. There is a huge resource of indigenous vegetation remaining on the 1/3 of New Zealand that is in private land ownership, and that is the place where, if some greater incentive could be given, a lot of the reconnecting that I'm talking about could happen very quickly.
One more, can you see the possibilities of partnering up with DOC?
Yeah, so look, all sorts of partnerships are possible. I mean, there are funds out there, Nature Heritage Fund and different councils. I'm not aware of the detail of yours, but I'm sure you've got environmental funds as well that can be used to some extent. I know in the Waikato we have what's called the Natural Heritage Fund and an Environmental Initiatives Fund, and the Department of Conservation has the big national scale Forest Heritage Fund that they use as well. But the issue now still is, it's the magnitude of what we're talking about is not great. And we have seen in recent years greater input from philanthropic sources. So the Next Foundation and some of those other big foundations have been investing in a lot of this sort of work in recent years. But, you know, again, it's how do we get the coordination to achieve regional scale transformation? That requires close working relationships with the Department of Conservation, close working relationship with QE2, and I don't mean just occasionally meeting them in the corridor. I mean actually, where is the regional restoration plan where all of those parties have a coherent view on what is being done at regional scale? And in the National Policy Statement on Indigenous Biodiversity, that is what is required, the development of a regional restoration plan. That is not a separate plan like a conservation management strategy produced by the Department of Conservation and a plan produced by Hawke's Bay Regional Council. That is a coherent plan with all key players involved.
Well, thank you.
Councillor Graham.
Thank you, Bruce. That was definitely a great presentation, very inspirational. I enjoyed it greatly. There's a lot of activity going on. Every council's doing it, as you pointed out. There's a lot of pressure from the community. Practically everyone, every lifestyle is planting up trees. I mean, this is a real movement that's happening in New Zealand. But you don't think it's enough?
I still don't think it's enough, and the reason I don't think it's enough is that, I mean, look, I think that Hawke's Bay is actually in the front of the pack, I'll say that now. But with the development of Hawke's Bay biodiversity, I think one of the other characteristics of places that start getting this right is where the community starts to provide the leadership, and there is an independence in the system which allows people to not be concerned that they're being told what to do by the regulatory and compliance side of the operation. Now, I'm not trying to, you guys will bear with me. I'm just trying to think about the best way to achieve it. And I think there has to be some sort of independence built into the system where the community at the end of the day essentially takes ownership for this problem. I think that's the next big step that needs to occur. But the bottom line is, unless we can get that coordinated approach to the funding ecosystem, this is what is also an attribute of collective impact, is where is the philanthropy, where's the DOC funding, where's the regional council funding, where is all of the bits coming together in a way more coherent way, and where is, I guess, the prevention of this constant annual grind of every small group competing with each other to find their little bit of the share of the cash. I think we're just going to have to, all I'm saying is we need to be more innovative, and actually I am absolutely certain that the order of magnitude of shift we're making now is not enough. We're going to, until every council signs on to the minimum 10%. Every council in New Zealand, I mean, not just a few that have seen the opportunity like New Plymouth, until they all do it, and until we all really understand the level of shift we have to make. That's part of the thing. Do we really understand what it would take to make this a permanent recovery of Indigenous biodiversity? I'm extremely optimistic in the sense that, who would have thought we would have had all of that money going into predator control 3 years ago? I would never have thought this was possible. We're seeing the signs of it, but I just think we've got to admit that we've got to lift our sights. It's got to be regional scale, not just I'm doing this here and I'm doing this here.
Councillor Fernbeck.
Yeah, you make some very good points. I've just learned of a new saying, and that actually culture eats strategy for breakfast.
Yes.
So its strategy is we have to do something because the policy says so.
Yes.
Culture is what you have shown us there.
Exactly.
And when we talk about corridors, we've got lots of corridors we often work on. We talked about it this morning about the drainage system, the poor quality of our water in our drainage system here in for instance, Napier. Yeah. Whenever we work on that, as soon as we get a machine or a digger or a person in there, we should be thinking, what else do we need to do in conjunction? Yeah. And it's the same with our roading network. Whakakotahi, when they put an intersection somewhere in place, they put some really nice native planting, and that's where it stops. And they've got this whole corridor full of hay bales and whatnot, because that's all they know to do. Yeah. But while it's open, plant it up. Yeah. And that's really what we're saying. And if you would have listened to our discussions this morning, I'm pretty well sure you would have put a slide in there that actually, if you actually do native planting and biodiversity, that water will improve at the same time.
Yeah, that's right. It's about how you integrate those activities. I mean, and again, I'm not being disrespectful, but
you're allowed to.
I've worked with so many city councils, for example, where the drainage unit doesn't talk to the Parks and Gardens unit, who don't talk to the, and the issue is the opportunities when presented need to be capitalised on. The full potential of the opportunity needs to be recognised, where you can actually get that multiple benefit instead of just saying, oh no, we're going to fix the drain, right? So it just takes a different sort of thinking, and it takes a style of collaboration.
And the culture needs to be set.
Yeah, and by the way, the saying that you reported on wasn't invented by the man that they said it was.
Okay.
Councillor Williams. Thank you.
Thank you. Look, thank you, Dr. Clarkson. We've had some wonderful presentations from the social ecology of Hawke's Bay, who have presented on their restoration efforts up and down the Rohe, and to have that framework that you've given us without any disservice to those presentations, that was the single best presentation I've had as a councillor since we got here.
Yeah.
Particularly for the urban focus of it. That's of interest to me as an Ahuriri councillor. My question is this: have you read David Attenborough's book, A Life on This Planet, talking about rewilding the world? And did you see your vision that you've shared with us as consistent with what he was saying?
Yeah, reasonably so, except rewilding is a really northern hemisphere way of describing things, because they're constantly thinking about when am I going to bring the wolf back, and when am I going to bring the beaver and the otter and all of that sort of stuff. And I just think the thing we have to be a bit careful with rewilding concepts is that actually we come from a very different system in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Our major characteristic is isolated island syndrome, and we've got to keep this in our brain all of the time. When we start seeing Northern Hemisphere researchers telling us what to do in New Zealand, they always get it wrong. They don't understand that actually the new program that's just come out recently, the new series of videos you're going to be able to watch on the history of New Zealand that's been funded by Predator Free New Zealand, we only had bats as mammals, and of course the whales and the dolphins and all the rest in the ocean. But our system is so different that many of the concepts built into rewilding and are as outlined by David Attenborough work well in the Northern Hemisphere, but they don't actually work too well here. So just remember that. He's on the right track, but he just needs to remember that we're different.
Yeah, we're different.
Thank you.
Councillor Foss.
Thanks very much. Just what struck me as you're speaking is I have very, very high ambitions for our waterways here, across Rarotonga in particular.
Yeah.
And I've been talking with a few of my colleagues around let's be very ambitious, let's have audacious goals. But actually I'm recalibrating that completely, in that they're the right goals, they're the floor, not the top of the mountain, if you like.
Yeah.
And your pragmatism with the way you've described it here, but just joining the dots and pulling it together. And can I ask, you made a great example with New Plymouth, and yes, maybe they're ahead out of the blocks earlier because of what they did many years ago. That's fine. But there's low-hanging fruit in front of every territorial authority, regardless if it's a 3-metre or a 30-metre strip. And the Ahuriri plan you looked at before, and Christchurch, an act of God, an act of nature, doesn't matter, it's there. And so any kind of final thoughts on that? I love what you're saying, because talk's cheap, get on with the job. But any final thoughts, because the independence side of it that you touched on earlier, I'm a huge advocate of that, because there's many of those little groups that you've described getting on with it in spite of territorial authorities, because love and passion for the environment was actually why you do a QE2. There's no financial gain in it.
Yeah, well, again, I will come back to that. It is that cultural thing. I mean, I came off a farming family that as soon as the government agency man drove up the driveway, well, actually, my grandmother was known to have removed the weed inspector from the site with a stock whip. But you see, the point I'm making is it's deeply ingrained in people to resent authority, some people anyway, and the only way you're going to break through is actually if it's when somebody of their own comes knocking on the door and says, for goodness sake, what the hell are you doing that for? Why don't you do this? Instead of, oh, I'm going to take you down to the Environment Court and I'm going to sting you, right? So it is just a cultural thing. And so we've got to be always looking for ways to find the point of entry to make the difference. So, I mean, my main advice, though, is you do need to aim high. But you also need to understand that it's a long-term game. So it's an intergenerational activity. It's not something that you or I can do in our generation. It's going to take, look, 1920s, straight after the First World War was when the big land clearances start. And then after the Second World War, it started all over again. And the point about this is that it's 200 years at least, but you've got to have a plan and you've got to have the commitment to know that you're going to stick with the plan for the long run. Maori don't need to be told this. They know this. They had 800 years of ecological history sitting behind them. I think the point here is, though, we've got to sign on for the long run. And you know, we wrap this up in all sorts of ways. It's like, if we don't do this, actually, we will pay the price. And I'm not being an environmental doomsayer. In 1968, when I heard my first lecture at Massey University from the great New Zealand historian Bill Oliver, W.H. Oliver, who wrote History of New Zealand in 1968, in his first chapter, he said, there are two things that New Zealanders will have to come to grips with in the next century. One, their relationship with Maori. Two, what they've done to the environment. That's what he said in 1968. Man, I believe every word of it. Because actually we just went too far, too quickly in terms of the environment. And coming from a farming family, I understand why we did it. You know, we got off the boat, basically, and we had to make a living, and if we didn't, we were dead. It's as simple as that, right? We would, you know, we had to produce a product that somebody in the UK demanded of us and put it on a refrigerated ship and send it back, right? But actually, if we had our time over again, think about this. What would we have done? What innovative things should we have done with the way we used our native forest, the way we used more? Dare I say it? Imagine we could have been farming those guys, you know. There's all sorts of things we could have been doing. We've got to be constantly thinking about the long run, intergenerational, and getting it fixed for the future, for the next generation and the generation after. That's my final thought.
Thank you.
Thank you. O tēnei te mihi ki a koe, Bruce, and thank you for all your contribution. The years of study, the continued years of study, I'd say, and your advice. So thank you very much for coming. And I'd like to move that we receive and note this presentation. Do I have a seconder? Thank you, Councillor Fenbake. All those who agree, say aye.
Aye.
Those against, carried. Thank you very much. Kia ora. Now, before we move on to the next item, sorry, James, you've been waiting most of the afternoon. We have two options, members. We have gone over the 6-hour mark for the meeting. So I do recommend that we resolve to go over that 6 hours just for our last item. So that is my recommendation. So all those who agree to extend the meeting beyond 6 hours per standing order 4.2, do you say aye?
Aye.
Those against? Thank you. We will continue with our last presentation. Oh, sorry, I'll move. Who would like to second?
I'm happy to second.
Second. Oh, Councillor Fenbake. All those who agree say aye.
Aye.
Those against? Carried. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. And yes, a fantastic sort of, kind of a hard act to follow actually, but a great segue, thank you, Bruce, to our next item, which is going to a small way to the very issue Bruce raised around Napier and Ahuriri estuary. So this bit of work's actually been sitting with us for a little while. We hope to have brought it to you in February this year, but didn't quite get the report finalised in time. And look, it goes back to conversations with council and requests that you've made of us to kind of say, look, actually, there's a bunch of agencies working across the estuary with people, resources, programs, that it just makes sense we get better visibility of, we get better organised around, we look to combine, we're practical, collaborate to see if we can achieve much more with the same kind of investment that we've got now. So it's kind of that small part of the jigsaw that Bruce talked about, collaboration, understanding broadly what the system is we're operating in. So James Powery, who used to work for us a few years ago as a land management person and heavily involved in our forestry activities. Now freelances as a project manager, has got out amongst our broader community and done some work. That has been reported, and our apologies, the report didn't end up as an attachment with the paper, but it's in Stella if you want to go and look at it. James has gone away to do the very work that we've just talked about, understand who's who, what they're doing, and what the opportunities are, particularly starting in a small way with the statutory agencies, those agencies that are kind of mandated and resourced to do work, what possibilities we've got to do more and do better. So James is going to run you through a presentation on his findings, and then happy to take questions and have a discussion.
Okay, so essentially this process started around a year ago, and Ian said go and catch up with 20 people across the key regulatory agencies in Hawke's Bay who have activities relating to the Ahuriri estuary and its catchment. Each one of those interviews led to somebody else who they said was essential content, and each one of those also suggested someone else. So we've seen 55 people to date, and I've probably got another 55 people on that essential to see list who are probably feeling disenfranchised one at a time. So essentially it boiled down to a number of strands of potential collaborative activity, and then Ian and I have caught up and determined that communications and biodiversity were seen as key areas or rallying points that kind of wrap those together and allow for focus and aligning some efforts and making some early gains. So this diagram's out of the Parliamentary Commissioner's report from August 2020, managing our estuaries, and it's for the Porirua estuary. And essentially it's displaying a horrendogram, if you like, of all of the agencies and activities relating to that. And we could certainly draw one very similar for Ahuriri. And I guess the thing is that all of this complexity brings with it the potential for inertia. Every time one of those lines crosses or there's a regulatory conflict, then there's room for inertia to build. So the PCE report had a one-page dedicated to the need to have strong champions for an estuary who drive beyond that, who can get the big picture outside the intrigue of particular agencies and push forward. So the report that Ian referred to being in Stella, that's really well summarised in the overview report, but it just develops some of those things further. And the three appendices that were attached to this report for the meeting belong to that report, the wider report that's on Stella. There's also an interview content database. So in the appendices, you can see by role and organisation who was interviewed, the 55 interviewees. And beyond that, there's a database of content which contains the headlines, the nuggets, the frustrations, the potential collaborations, the existing collaborations, the personal and organisational aspirations that were behind that. And there's a lot of material in there that's sensitive at an organisational and a personal level. So that content will be available once we develop strands and share those sensitively between collaborating parties. So what I've done here on a forest fire sign style display is just to spread the impressions that arose from talking to 55 people. So essentially over to the left where we've got the red zone of undesirable behaviour. Thankfully there was less of that reported, but obviously there's a lot of frustration around recidivist behaviour that's affecting the water quality particularly. More unconscious behaviours, repeated things, pretending to care was a theme that came through, seeing things again and again that aren't improving. Now, as we come into the orange zone, we've got the zone of discouragement, attempting to look good, dollars are being spent, things may stay the same, incongruent behaviours. And then the needle probably centres where most people were landing, in the sense that they're reporting many unacceptable or acceptable practices occurring, but generally that they're frustrated with inertia, that the handbrake's on relative to their ideals as an organisational party or as an individual.
James, are they words from the interviews?
Yeah, so I'm trying to reflect the kind of mode level response, or the tone of that. And then obviously the highly desirable zone, we'd be looking at the mana of Ahuriri estuary being fully restored, and there's some activities that are certainly standing out in terms of excellence, and there are many. But I guess in terms of the collective soup that's being made, it's far more in the in that middle zone there. So when I say incongruence, on one hand we're talking about a place that we reflect on as a regional and a city treasure. It's the heart of the city. On the other hand, we're dumping into it. So which is it? We've got sort of that recidivist behaviour around industrial chemicals. We've got road washings. We've got garbage visible. That photograph down on the left, it probably represents 5 square metres of the estuary. There's fishing line there. There's shotgun wads. There's tyres. There's flotsam, jetsam, and there's tube worm, all apparent. Now, over on the right-hand side, we've got that sort of more desirable world where the water is clean. There are 70 to 95 bird species extant. So the resident park manager counted 95 bird species in the estuary between 1985 and 2015. And DOC are saying probably something like 70 frequent resident species. So we've got some baselines that are really interesting. But I guess going back to Bruce Clarkson's comments about biodiversity, it's about the web, it's about the interactions and the interrelationships. So a tone that came through is that there are many things that we would do or we wouldn't do if only we knew what those impacts were and what was available. So on the left-hand side, we've got orca and calf coming in to eat some stingrays. Boat painting slipway in the background. What's the effluent spilling off there? I don't know, but certainly be better for mum and her calf if they weren't probably eating a stingray in there when the wrong things are issuing into the estuary. On the right-hand side, we've got the sign displayed at the same time saying, don't take the kaimoana. All right for us, but the sign's not facing the water, is it? So she can't read that. And then down the bottom, we've got the sort of milky cloud entering the estuary. That's paint coming in from the stormwater system. And this is a week after the orca and calf are in there. So I guess when I saw that, the impact on me was, which of these things is going to stop first? Are we going to stop pouring crap in there, or are these species going to stop visiting because unpalatable food, or they're dead? So orcas are nationally critically threatened species. It's in the category of Maui and Hector's dolphins. We should be making sure that when they visit, they're getting a clean feed. So the biodiversity nub, this was kind of a agglomeration, if you like, of many strands of potential collaboration and existing collaboration. Signals were that biodiversity dies by 1,000 cuts. And many of those losses, once you lose a species or it stops returning, that those things are irretrievable often, like no money will turn that around. So we've got to really to look hard at this together. There are many successful initiatives in place. There's plenty to celebrate. There's amazing work happening with habitat, with the web around whitebait, with bittern restoration, with the return of spotless crake, and there are there's many things to be joyful about, but there's also a very long way to go. If we improve conditions for resident species and the habitat that holds them, then we'll be improving the overall state. We're talking about making things better for these canaries in the mine. Now, our community enjoys the estuary. It loves recreating there, walking around its edges, cycling and swimming and doing water sports. But it's not truly connected to its issues. And that theme was repeated. and it's, as a community, we're certainly not committed to its repair. Otherwise, things would be going in a better direction. So in essence, communications towards more coordination and collaboration will be key to improvement. And commitment to improvements, that's nuance. There's a nuance there around continuing to measure decline is not the same as committing to improvement. We need to really distinguish that and get on with making things better. So a real signal was that we needed coordinated and urgent insistence on things getting better, on improvement. So communications to support that. I think we all know that the estuary needs urgent help. No one person can put their finger on all of the answers. No one knows exactly how to do that, and it's going to take a community which really reflects on Dr. Clarkson's comments about how the city needs to be behind improving this. Celebration of successes. I mean, like I was saying, there's many things that are going beautifully, but most of the city probably doesn't know about them. And if they did, perhaps they'd understand the importance of those things that go along with that. For instance, when Godwits fly to New Zealand from Siberia, they arrive having lived on a couple of teaspoons of fish oil probably, and of their body fat, and they arrive and they need to have some undisturbed recuperation time. Wrong time for a Labrador to go running through that zone where they're having that time. So really having those communications around what's important and who needs to be left alone, and making sure our recreational experiences are designed around that as well. So yeah, the underpinning signal, aligning efforts to determine paths to predictable successes. So predictable successes was a term that came out of someone who's working with wildlife in the estuary on a number of properties. Said when you've got no budget, you need to plan well and really execute with a very faithful approach. And I think we all need to take that on. So to summarise, I think the antidotes to the inertia and the incongruence that we were sort of experiencing during the interviews and uncovering are around reflecting the urgency that is necessary to address many of these challenges. The word pace came up, particularly around biodiversity, in the sense that these death by 1,000 cuts type experiences that are facing a lot of our species, they've got a pace of their own. We need to match that with restoration efforts that are serious, and we need to align our different organisations so that they're all participating in a meaningful sense, that our communications are of a like. If one organisation's communicating in about something, it's really good if there's parallel flavour to the communications that come out of another. Now, a word that came up during this was hoia, and that's to thrust the spear. That was one of the interviewees used that term. It's also used to illustrate driving the paddle into the water when you're paddling a canoe. And the offering with that word was to think about that and just to be to adopt seriousness and moving forward with these matters relating to our Hariri estuary. So, thank you.
Kia ora, James. Does anyone have a question for James? Councillor Curtin, go on.
Thanks, James. Where did the scope for your survey, what's the genesis of that, please?
Okay, so that was a conversation with Ian initially around engaging with the agencies who have regulatory responsibility around the estuary and its catchment. And so principally Napier City Council, Department of Conservation, Hawke's Bay Regional Council, Hastings District, and then the airport.
Okay.
And then you'll see from Appendix 2 that there was quite a spread and interacting set of wider agencies. So you get into the Airport Authority, MPI, NZTA, all having an impact and having some sort of intersecting interest or responsibility.
Okay. I mean, I appreciate the brief that you've given. I just wonder that those same agencies have had that mandates a plan put out in 1989, and I wondered whether in fact you're talking to the right people. I appreciate their opinions, but I note one farmer, one landowner there. You've got recorded as being interviewed. I wonder at the value of the interviews you've had, and whether in fact we ought to be talking to a larger number of people that actually can influence the outcome for the estuary. And I'm just, this was not a big complaint, but a complaint nevertheless. The entity I'm involved with has spent $500,000 of its own money in the last 5 years, and our door wasn't darkened for your interview. So I'm not convinced that this achieves a hell of a lot when the real issues are not here, they're out there.
So, Councillor, perhaps I can just chip in, given I was the one that kind of worked with James and scoped it. And recall that the scoping, if you like, came from this table and from many other conversations we've had around the estuary, where, and I'll reflect the words of Perry Prentice, to the effect of just get on with it. You guys have got the resources, you've got jobs to do. Why are you not talking to each other and working with each other to share your objectives, to share resources, to coordinate your activities, to get on and do some good stuff? So it started with that very small, accept narrower view of the estuary to say there are agencies who are today, right now, active with programs in and around the estuary. Are we joined up, lined up, coordinated, integrated, working together to get best leverage towards outcomes? And the two outcomes that obviously come from this are biodiversity. Do we have our biodiversity objectives lined up, and are our programs working together to achieve that? When we communicate with our people, are we saying the same things? Or are we completely contradicting each other about what we're trying to achieve or where we're going? So it started with a very narrow focus. Absolutely accept that, to Bruce's point, it takes a community to shift the dial on this. But the first incremental step in the dial in movement is those with the current work and the resources and the mandate, or the obligation, if you like, the expectation from the community to do things. Are they doing that to the most in the most effective way in partnering and collaborating? And I think, certainly from my experience, the answer to that question is no. This sets up a really nice platform to shift that dial.
Yeah, James, thanks for that. I think you've done a fantastic job finding out all this stuff. And it was either in your report or in one of the others that it said, we're getting to a stage where it's irreversible, which worries me. And I don't know whether you were here when the Nature Council did their presentation. So are you, given that you're independent here and you're looking at it, are you happy with the collaboration that Regional Council and Napier City Council are going on, and with DOC and with Tana Te Whenua and the other thing, the movement forward? Are you happy with the movement forward, or is it Ian's comment that...
I think that coordination is where the opportunity lies, in the sense that there's a lot of high quality activities or ingredients, but the soup that's being made together in literal terms, in terms of the water quality and what's arriving in the estuary, are testament to things needing to be better. And I think that coordination and collaboration is probably about using the resourcing that's already existing in a more effective way if we're communicating better. So so I'd be much happier if the water was looking as I know it can on a good day, and that would be the evidence that things were effective.
Are we going backwards or forwards?
Yeah, I think standing still's not standing still's not good enough. I think probably there's many celebratable efforts, but in a net sense relative to where things should be, then it's only backwards.
I think in terms of the contaminant loading, from what we saw earlier today, that's being exacerbated, and there'll be persistent pollutants that will be increasing in their concentration of things like the sediments, which will have long-term effects. So I think certainly in some areas, but then like with bird life, probably it's going in the right direction. But to the coordination point, I guess, so Pity said get on with it, but what I've taken from this is actually there's a coordination piece that's required, and actually the key question we have to ask ourselves is, are we going to have coordinated governance across the estuary and a coordinated management plan, which was the remit of Te Komiti, and Te Komiti has not been functional for the last couple of years. So are we going to wait for the Mana Ahuriri treaty settlement process to conclude for that to actually be formally constituted, mandated and up and running, or are we going to get on as the community responsible for this and have governance and have an action plan in the absence of that treaty settlement being completed? I think that's the elephant in the room, almost.
Can we do the committee without the settlement?
Well, all the parties can, but I think, as I understood it, there were efforts by particularly Councillor Curtin to try and get that committee operating. But it is at the moment it is chaired by representatives from Mana Ahuriri, and they need the time, space, energy, commitment, etc., to be pulling that committee together, and I would say on a very regular basis, so that resources are committed to developing the plan and executing the plan.
Councillor Foss.
There is a question in here somewhere. Think of it at the end. Just thanks very much for your presentation and the series of papers we've had today. This is why I'm here. I know gravel and flood protection is very interesting and essential, but it ain't why I'm here. I'm here for this stuff. And the honesty, I don't mean that in a negative way, just confrontation, the brutal confrontation of where things are at. And the part that we can play, which is different to the part where we are mandated to play. The difference between the two is leadership, and we talk about leadership and other things such as climate change and mitigation 30 years out. So I'm very interested in furthering this conversation, and I take Councillor Curtin's point, like all of these things, they've been around a while, but it just got dirtier today because of someone else chucked some bloody paint down the tube somewhere, and regardless of what happened there, who did it, the fact that someone thought it was okay to do that is the cultural challenge, and that's a bit I'd really like to address. So I guess I'll put the question as, what does happen next from all of what we've seen today? There are many barriers in the way. The biggest barrier is us, as far as we're concerned, and what our ambitions are and what we're going to do. So I'm really interested to see where that conversation goes amongst ourselves for the next environment meeting and when we take this to the full council. And obviously for all waterways across Hawke's Bay. But that's quite pertinent what we're seeing here. So I'll just leave that one on the table, and I'll leave the question unanswered.
Chair, perhaps I could help. 40 to 44 layout next steps. 44 is probably the most relevant. To the point you make, I think leadership's the right terminology to use here. In the absence of somebody doing something, somebody's got to step up to the plate and say, let's get organised and do this job. What we're proposing as staff is that we will work with staff from the other agencies to share this, get together, talk about it, and then start where we can formalising the operational kind of components of our work and agreeing where we can within our mandate to align, coordinate those activities. It's not to go as far as formalising governance. That can come in time, but there's nothing to stop us operationally getting on with some of the stuff. And I think the example Chris had this morning with the collaboration around water quality monitoring with Napier City is a really good example, but it's one of many examples we can just get on with.
So another question, Chair. Presumably, if the LTP gets passed as proposed, the coordination officer for the Ahuriri catchment is therefore that person. So therefore, I imagine they're just going to put another label on their desk because much of this work is in chain, and we need to thread a whole lot of things through the needle. That's how I see that role evolving. Is that person?
Well, that role is, as you know, is particularly focused on the community coordination and community engagement piece. And I think to the point that Dr. Clarkson was making is that there is a huge, and actually it comes through James's story as well, there's a huge amount of community energy, enthusiasm, potential funding. What we need somebody doing is actively playing that coordination role. So in that end of the Karamu catchment as well. So you've got an opportunity to make a positive decision in the next couple of weeks on resourcing that. And we'll be seeking to recruit those roles reasonably quickly. And obviously the Ahuriri Regional Park also is a key component of that too.
Thanks, well done.
Madam Chair, I'm going to need to go.
Okay, thank you, Councillor. Are there any more questions for James? Okay, can we please have a mover and a seconder? Councillor Curtin, Councillor Foss, seconder. Would you like to speak?
Just very briefly, thanks for the report. It's good. It's very good work. It's useful work. My comments are around probably what's next. For example, have we shown leadership to Hastings District with only 2 engagements with Hastings, given the possible impact of their catchment on the estuary? So it's that, if you like, detail in that, and then those other land users, which is important. It's about getting on with it, and the getting on with it, in my mind, is putting more trees in the right places, and hopefully that's our next step. I'm really interested to have the intel on the catchment itself. For example, I've got 30,000 plants that can go into the ground anytime soon, and I want to know where to put them. So if someone can tell me that from the team, I'd be very grateful.
Councillor Foss.
Yeah, thanks again. Other than you've set a fantastic benchmark for the papers on the Karamu, which are forthcoming. So I look forward to those and such in-depth analysis. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Any more comments? No? All those who note and agree to accept the presentation, say aye.
Aye.
Those against, carried. Thank you very much. There is the minor item. Councillor, would you like it or no?
I'll flag
You'll
that.
renege.
What
Yep.
time? Because Mr. Williams is gone.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much.
That minor.
Well, thank you, members. Thank you, staff and presenters. It's been a fantastic day. I've thoroughly enjoyed all our kōrero. So would anyone like to volunteer to close our meeting?
Craig will.
I'm happy to do it. Okay. We'll do kia tau. So join in, please. Kia tau, kia tātou katoa, te ata whai o tō tātou ariki a ihu karaiti, me te aroha o te atua, me te whiwhi ngā tahitanga ki te wairua tapu, ake ake, āmene. Thank you. Safe travels home.
How much rain have you had?